Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Today we hear that 40 peers in the House of Lords have failed to complete a simple form requiring them to state their outside business interests. It's probably just as well they're not applying for welfare. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we'll be talking to theology professor Paul Middleton to get his take on matters spiritual and temporal and on what's happening in Scotland and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. Details of how to submit questions or comments are on the What's On guide at whatson.scot. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Enjoy the show. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation talks to Paul Middleton. How are you, Paul? The pandemic is abating, but it seems that it's still around. And how has it affected you?
Thanks, great to be here. The pandemic is one of those things that just seems to be with us, and we kind of think we're shaking it off, but numbers just are increasing. As it's really affected higher education quite severely, actually. As you know from the news, we've been grappling with online lectures, students having to isolate in halls of residence, and we've, although in Chester, actually, we've managed to escape the worst of it in terms of our students. We've obviously had to switch from face-to-face to online. And really, with just a couple of days' notice, a year past March, we were all told to vacate our offices and start working from home. And that was a very steep learning curve. I know that it's fashionable for folk to say, perhaps students should get their fees back. But I have to say, academics have worked harder than ever to try to both learn how to use the technology, to deliver online lectures, to try and encourage people to participate in our seminars. And then we managed to get back face-to-face a bit in September last year. And that was great to be back, but it was kind of blended. So some face-to-face, some online. And then, of course, the lockdown affected us once more. So it's really been kind of stop and start. And I'm in my office here, but I'm the only person that's been in the building for the last 3 months, so it's actually quite lonely as well. But we're hoping to start back in September again with mainly students in the lecture hall, although there will be some online element. But it's been a really steep learning curve, and I think we'll all be glad to get back to some kind of normality.
Tell me, has it affected student numbers? I mean, obviously it's affected their quality of their education as it has in terms of the quality that you can provide or wish to provide, because you've got this technology in the way, as it were. Obviously it's a help as well, but has it actually affected the numbers of students? I mean, has that changed in any way?
Well, it's probably affected different universities in different ways, because as you'll know, the A-level and higher results have been slightly higher than in previous years. So that means that actually more students have gone to universities, but that's been unevenly distributed. I do obviously want to say that the quality of the actual teaching, it's the same people doing the teaching and the same material, and actually there are kind of very creative ways to do that teaching. But the experience of students at university has of course been affected in terms of socializing and meeting one another and participating in on-campus activities. But the online has made us have to work in new creative ways, some ways which we might actually keep. But yeah, that experience has been really quite different for different groups of people, and some universities are paying people to defer. So it's worked out differently for different institutions.
Great. Tell us a bit about yourself, Paul, because your journey started, if I can use that term, in Glasgow. You've been a Church of Scotland minister along the way. You've ministered at St Giles and other places in Edinburgh. You've spent some time in the States, and now here you are, a professor of theology in Chester. What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, well, so I was brought up in Glasgow, the kind of south side of Glasgow, originally Shawlands, and then Crowfoot. I went to Kings Park at secondary school, and my family was kind of the first to kind of own their own house in the in Shawlands and Crowfoot, and like so many other people, I was brought up by a single parent eventually, with me, my brother and sister, and my mum always really encouraged us to do as well as we could, and that was a real kind of inspiration to. My mum kind of worked 2 jobs to kind of keep the house and to make sure we didn't lose out at Christmas. And only later do you realise the kind of sacrifices that a lot of parents, particularly single parents, make. I kind of got involved in the church quite early on, but not. I used to go to mass with my gran. Quite a lot of families in Glasgow are obviously these kind of mixed marriages, and my mum was Catholic, and my dad was actually, so I'm told, a member of the Orange Lodge, and I think he actually played the accordion in the bands. But I think my mum made him give that up. So it was a kind of interesting dynamic there. But I went to church to join the choir because I was into music, and indeed, actually, my first degree at Glasgow University was in music. But I felt a call to ministry in the Church of Scotland, and I went to get some life experience. I did a couple of years voluntary work in a homeless hostel in London, and that was a kind of great eye-opener, really, to what had been a kind of sheltered kind of upbringing. But then did theology, and spent a year in Princeton studying, and then I went to St Giles to be the assistant minister, and kind of Glaswegian going to Edinburgh. I was on the phone to the minister of St Giles, and he said, "Oh, just meet me at St Giles." And I don't think he's ever recovered from what I said next, which was, "And where is St Giles again?" And then I did a PhD at Edinburgh, and got a job down in Wales, in the University of Wales, in remote Lampeter, and came up to Chester about 11 years ago. That's it in a nutshell.
I mean, that's quite a varied journey in many respects, because here you were ministering at some stages, you were helping in hostels on another, and I assume that the latter was fairly basic. That was really hands-on, I take it, when you were helping people in a hostel, because they come to you and their problems are in your face, as it were.
Yes, I'm not even sure you'd probably be allowed to do this, because I was a volunteer, and I lived in a hostel with 5. It was a hostel for young single homeless men, and we had a similar one for women as well. So I was just left there kind of overnight, and I'm not actually sure you could probably do that without a lot of training nowadays. But back then that was. But it was a great experience, and
did people just walk in just off the street?
No, people would have to be referred, and we had only 5 rooms, so it was supported accommodation. It was actually a faith-based hostel, which was attached to a drug and alcohol rehab just outside Reading.
There's a question from Ruth Hanratty. She's saying, does Paul know of Tom Scott and Bob Kernahan?
I don't.
Tom is described as a minister.
But well, there's probably about 1,000 ministers in the Church of Scotland. So, I thought it's one of these things you kind of look across the assembly and you might recognise folk.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, don't worry, Stephen. We'll be coming to your question shortly. Stephen's got a question on the timing of an independence referendum. But I wanted to ask you, which of your roles have you found the most challenging, and why?
That's a really good question. I mean, they've all had challenges at different kinds of challenges at different times. I mean, obviously, being a minister in the Church of Scotland had well, as well as being with people at really high points like weddings. Obviously, we take a lot of funerals and are there when people are at their lowest. So it was a privilege, obviously, to be with people. And now that I'm no longer in a parish, I've actually had the times that I kind of practice a bit is when I'm invited to go somewhere to preach or conduct friends' weddings. So that's always a real high point. Obviously, being a university lecturer has its it's a great job. I really enjoy doing what I do, interacting with students and other colleagues, publishing and researching and going to conferences. So I really do enjoy the role, and it's I suppose when you're mixing with the young people all the time, it perhaps keeps you young or makes you realise that you're getting old.
You find that young people are more or less religious than older folks?
So there's been actually quite a lot of sociological work on this. So yes, it's true that people are becoming less religious, and that's gone in kind of waves, really. So you get the folk that say that they're kind of religious but not spiritual but not religious. Where that's kind of aware of kind of spiritual things, but it doesn't manifest itself in any kind of belief in kind of organized religion or so on. So certainly as the generations are going, that's certainly the case. I mean, now there's a phrase called the nuns, which are NONES rather than NUNS. Kind of easy to get mixed up when you're talking about religion. These are people that are that haven't so much rejected religion, but just really haven't kind of considered it. And that's a stage on from the kind of atheist movement, the new atheist movements from like Richard Dawkins and so on. The generation now would actually find somebody like Dawkins quite intolerant because the nuns tend to be actually very tolerant of different worldviews. They just choose not to really pick one for themselves. So it's kind of it's an interesting challenge for churches and religions going forward, because you can't really assume that people have got that same kind of notion of spirituality anymore.
Yeah. Here's a question right out of left field from Jock Gibson. He's asking if you have any theological or spiritual opinion on the jailing of Craig Murray. I did say it was coming out of left field.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm aware of it. I have to say, one of the things we might touch on is when you live in England, you don't really you have to work quite hard to get Scottish news. And it's maybe one thing we can chat about, what it's kind of like living in England with coverage. So I don't have a view on the actual substance of the case. I mean, I wasn't able to piece together any of the evidence, but I don't know the people involved, and so it does on the surface seem there is that kind of manifest unfairness, that one person in particular should be picked on, given the perhaps others were reporting similar things, but I just don't have a view. I'm afraid I don't have enough information to. Well,
let's talk about the larger point that you made there about having access to what's happening in Scotland, because you have a very active view on independence, which we'll come on to in a second. So it must be a particular burden not to have available to you pretty much straightforwardly the data that's available to everyone in Scotland. I mean, it's the Craig Murray thing was in all the papers. It's commonplace, and yet here you are. Even though it was, front page news, it wasn't covered elsewhere. So, what's your general view about the way Scottish affairs are dealt with?
Yeah. So Scotland really only is covered in the kind of UK news when something happens. So obviously the run up to the referendum in 2014 was covered periodically, but it's actually the case that it was really only in the couple of months beforehand that the BBC in London kind of took a real interest and got a lot of things wrong because they were just suddenly rushing into it. After the 2015 general election, when the SNP won most of the seats, Scotland was actually on the agenda quite a bit because, of course, there was a higher profile for SNP politicians, which, rightly or wrong, it was just although there was exactly the same number of Scottish MPs, Scotland had enjoyed a much higher profile in Westminster. And obviously there were more representation on programmes like Question Time and so on, although, again, not as much as other third parties had enjoyed. After the 2017 election, it just disappeared from the radar when the SNP lost seats. So I think it's important to realise that there is this kind of political narrative. And even the covering of the pandemic, Scotland's mentioned as a kind of afterthought quite a bit. Even on the kind of UK news, which of course everyone in Scotland's got access to as well. But for us, it's the main piece of news. And what's allowed to happen is a story will break. So people in England think that Scotland's really behind in the vaccinations because that was reported when Scotland was slightly behind and was never kind of corrected, or well, there's no reason to correct it if you're thinking about that narrative. So people are just left with sometimes some of these impressions. The same is true of the kind of testing and so on. So it's actually kind of interesting the way Scotland is seen as relatively peripheral on the. If you're living in England, you really do have to make an effort to find out what's going on in Scotland.
How much of that is actually? How much of that would actually read across to, say, Northern England, for example? I mean, how much of that is down to what's increasingly known as a metropolitan clique or some kind of, i.e. a group of people whose views, who maybe control most of the mass media, but who are very firmly located in one central spot. And I just wonder how much of what you've just described would also apply, say, to the north of England, where people there might feel, hey, very little that happens here impacts the national news unless it's something negative, or there's been a landslide or some fatality, and all of a sudden you get sort of 10 seconds that says, oh, look, this happened in Manchester. But anyway, let's forget that. Let's go on to something more interesting.
That's a really good question. So I suppose issues like health and education and transport and so on, these are kind of England-wide issues, and they are kind of reported as if they are kind of Britain-wide. And so Wales is obviously in the same boat as Scotland in many ways. I live in the northwest of England, and I suppose I don't feel as neglected in the same way. I mean, I think, obviously there's a strong focus on Westminster and Westminster politics. But I suppose figures like Andy Burnham, the kind of mayor of Manchester, just helps keep the north of England on the agenda a bit. So it's not... I mean, you're right that the agenda, of course, is set. And I'm not even saying this is a particularly deliberate thing. It's sometimes it's kind of carelessness that on the kind of UK news, a health or education story will be reported without any acknowledgement. This only affects one of the nations of the UK. So I think that's what I mean by Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well, probably even more being on the periphery. But you're right that there is a certain London-centric bias in, I guess, what might be regional London news might be covered in a way in which... Yeah,
because, I'm looking at the piece from the Times where the Archbishop of York is calling for a re-evaluation of the English question. And he says that he actually accuses London of being run by the metropolitan elite, labeling people who are proud to be English as backwardly xenophobic. I mean, he clearly has a very strong view, and presumably because he's presumably has a seat in the House of Lords, so he's in a position to not just be a member of the church, a very senior member of the church, because right now he effectively is head of the church, as the Archbishop of Canterbury is on sabbatical. So it seems to me it's important that what he says is listened to, and he's really quite critical of the north-south divide, and particularly the rather interesting language that people in the south use about people in the north. And certainly I've noticed that too. You know, it's not been a central thing necessarily, but I've listened to the tone and I've thought, well, that is regrettable. I'm not sure you can just sort of take a big bunch of people like that and regard them as one. You know, if you did it about the south, people would be very upset, but somehow it's permissible to do it about the north.
There's economic disparity in England. I mean, obviously, London sucks up a lot of investment, and that's where a lot of the kind of wealth is generated. And that it's absolutely true that the North loses out there. I think what Stephen Cotterill, the Archbishop of York, there is reacting to is this idea that kind of Englishness is expressed. I mean, it's actually not a particularly coherent piece, actually, but he in one sense he wants to say that there needs to be a kind of national unity and something that binds English folk together as but he chooses one way of expressing that Englishness, which is through kind of Brexit. And what he's suggesting is that people in the south, well, not London in particular, kind of criticising the north for being, you know, Brexiteers, which they interpret as xenophobic, and that particular way of being English. I mean, I'm not persuaded that that's necessarily the best way of being English. I mean, I think this is something which has been covered in a lot of newspapers, columnists, particularly since the Euros, which encourage people to be English in a kind of different way. I mean, Gareth Southgate, I thought and the whole England team, I thought were real heroes and gentlemen, actually, in their conduct and this kind of more inclusive way of being English. I'm afraid it didn't quite manifest itself in being able to support England in the Euros. Although I did watch it with some of my English colleagues, and I'm ashamed to say that there was video footage of me singing the Italian. I'd learned the Italian national anthem for the final. So, but you know, I think that was they represented a really positive vision of what it meant to be English, such that, you know, you had this problematic Boris Johnson both trying to claim the England team to make political capital out of, yet being quite uncomfortable with their so-called wokeness. Which Priti Patel, of course, reacted against. But what Stephen Cotterill is trying to say, I mean, he longs for this kind of time where English and Britishness were effectively synonymous. And a lot of my kind of educated, kind of middle-class Guardian reading English friends say is, you know, they didn't really regard themselves as English, and they kind of regarded themselves as British. And they kind of get why, like, folk like me and other Scots get really annoyed by Britishness and Englishness being kind of collapsed together. So what the Archbishop of York is basically saying is, if to counter devolution in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, if you basically regionalise the whole of England, then kind of Scotland and England disappears into this great kind of Britishness that's held together in some kind of, I mean, he even says that, you know, Scotland playing England, he was struck by Scotland and England in the Euros, where Scotland sang Scotland the Brave and England sang the UK national anthem. But his dream of Scotland and England having their own anthems and then joining together to sing God Save the Queen, I suspect he's, you know, he needs to rethink that, because that's not going to happen.
Yes,
but it's a problem that he's trying to address. I don't think it's the right way of addressing it. But yeah, people are really thinking through what it means to be English in a inclusive way, rather than the kind of negative stereotypes that the right wing kind of British National Party kind of way of being English. There's a much more creative conversation that I think really ought to take place.
Yeah, my sense of it, reading the piece, was that he identified a problem, but his proposed response to that problem, or solution to that problem, struck me as naive. He says, for example, people should focus on institutions that bind them together, and he gives examples as the monarchy and the church. A lot of people would say, well, I don't know about that. So he moves on to say, okay, the NHS and the BBC. So I wondered if he quite thought that through, or whether, having identified the issue, he then maybe moved too quickly to looking at one or two areas which he thought might actually resonate. I'm just not sure.
The union hangs on cash in the attic.
Well, that's what it rather sounds like. It's just sort of, and that may well have been the case 10, 15 years ago, perhaps. I'm just not sure you could get the same traction in Scotland by saying what he said. I think it would produce a pushback.
It's a very Anglican way of thinking, actually.
Naive.
Yeah, I mean, the Church of England sometimes forgets that it is only the Church of England, and even the Church in Wales, which is Anglican, is disestablished, disappeared from the Church of England in the 1920s. And the Church of Scotland has, for hundreds of years, been really quite a different. Well, it's Presbyterian rather than Anglican, and really is quite a different beast with a different culture. And he's the problem. He has identified a problem, and he's taking part in this debate about Englishness. I don't think the vision of Englishness that he is promoting is really particularly helpful, and to just focus it on Brexit, because at the end of the day, although a majority of people in England did vote to leave the EU, it was still quite narrow. And but it's not helped by the fact that I suppose the Brexit divisions are along other kinds of lines, like age, for example, and education. So you can draw a straight line really with age. I think it's if you're 51, I think is the cut-off point where you're more likely to be a Brexit supporter, and then so it's really exacerbating these lines of not just geography but age and class, to use a kind of fairly clumsy term to capture that. So yeah, there's a lot of division there, and maybe the quest for a kind of Englishness is problematic, but folk are engaging in that debate, and it's a really interesting discussion, and I think it's a good thing to have that discussion. Yeah,
I mean, I would agree with that. I think for too long the debate's being conducted in a sort of, the debate really is about the Constitution. It's about how is the island governed, and because there is nothing, the British approach is to scorn regulation and sort of make it up as you go along. And there are tremendous advantages in doing that. I mean, if you're running an empire and you need to go from one country to the other, it makes a lot of sense not to be bound by some requirement that requires you to go and get permission to do it. You just sort of decide, it's South Africa today, we'll just do that. And if somebody comes along and asks you to support their conquest of India with an army, then you just say, yeah, let's do it, But the difficulty with that, instead of addressing the sort of main root cause, is you end up on the periphery talking about things like the BBC and the monarchy and stuff like that. Because it seems to me it should really be about the bread and butter stuff, i.e. you need to deal with what the values are and how common those values are across the piece. But I wanted to ask you a specific question. You're a very keen supporter of Scottish independence.
Yes.
How did that come about? Why? Because there's an argument that says, well, you're based outside Scotland. Maybe that would serve to attenuate that feeling. But in your case, it seems to have amplified it.
Yeah. So I when I was younger, I kind of felt I ought to be involved in politics, and so actually I joined the Labour Party as a teenager. So I was in Glasgow Cathcart, and went along to a few meetings. I can't actually remember when or why. I mean, I stopped being active, but I think it might have been over ID cards, which of course never materialized, that I decided that I would stop paying the membership. I suppose one of the kind of interesting things when I was younger is folk, regardless of their view in the Constitution, would just simply regard themselves as Scottish. I mean, I remember when I was in the Strathclyde Schools Symphony Orchestra, we were playing in the last night of the school's proms, and we were staying in a hotel, and we all filled in our forms that said nationality, and we all put Scottish, with not being making a point. That's just what we just unreflectively, that's what we thought of ourselves. We all had to fill in the cards again, which of course generated a sense of grievance there. But I started to support the SNP and independence. I think really once I moved to Edinburgh. I think that was the first time so I was mid-20s by that point, and then joined the SNP. And I think my attitude to kind of independence is it's just normal. So we get kind of the whole kind of nationalism or patriotism. Patriotism just leaves me cold. I mean, I don't really know what people are talking about. You know, when I think it was Gordon Brown that really first started talking about patriotism as opposed to nationalism, and I don't really know what the difference is, to be quite honest. But I suppose the main argument for me is the democratic argument. I think a country ought to get the government it votes for. And although, you know, that maybe was not quite terribly sharp in the kind of 90s and even the early the 2000s, I think most honest unionists, and by unionists I mean people that are particularly concerned about the union rather than necessarily people that would just vote no in an independence, would perhaps honestly admit that Brexit really has changed things. You know, Scotland obviously voted to remain in the EU, and nonetheless is being kind of dragged out. And the people that say, well, we voted as one United Kingdom, are simply restating the problem. It's, well, what's the significant political entity? You know, is it Scotland or is it the UK? Because to frame the argument that way, to deny there's a problem, is just simply to say you're effectively a British nationalist rather than a Scottish nationalist. And by nationalist there, I'm not using it in the kind of ethnic sense. I think most unionists are soft, civic British nationalists. They simply see the British state as the kind of primary political entity. So I was actually, for a year or two, branch secretary of the Edinburgh Central branch of the SNP. And you know, one of the things that I was reflecting on, I think I was secretary in 2000 when we were choosing the candidate for the 2003 election, and I think the result of the vote was 8-7. So there were like 15 people there, and you know, obviously following the referendum and the kind of mass membership, I you know, the figures for the Edinburgh Central. In fact, I think some of the numbers for the SNP selection, candidate selection, were greater than, you know, some council elections. So it's you know, things have obviously moved on as the SNP has become this mass movement. So it's the democratic argument for me is the main one, really. And you know, the fact that I'm not in Scotland, yeah, it means I don't get a vote, and I think that's absolutely right, because we're talking about civic nationalism here. And I suppose one of the lazier arguments against the SNP and independence is to kind of try to lump all nationalisms to say, I mean, whatever people think, no honest person could possibly think that the quest for Scottish independence or Scottish nationalism is anything like the right-wing ethnic nationalism of Europe. And you know, some people kind of do the jibe, oh yeah, your nationalism better than my nationalism, or you know, all nationalism is the same except mine. I mean, I think I think we have to be a bit more grown up about what's going on, and quite clearly, the Scottish nationalism and even soft British nationalism is quite different from the right-wing ethnic nationalism of Europe, and some of the more kind of extreme, UKIP, Nigel Farage, and kind of some of the that fueled Brexit, although that was fueled by all sorts of complex issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's an old adage that, see if I remember it right, that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel.
George Orwell that said that, I think.
And because it tends to get used at election times, which makes me wonder what your take is on Keir Starmer, whose view is, I don't want to have any coalitions or pacts or understandings even with any other party at the next UK general election, when he's defending one seat in Scotland. I mean, I have great difficulty working out the rationale there. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think I actually think it's really unfair of journalists to ask him this question, and that's why they ask him it, because there is no right answer. I mean, if he said yes, I would entertain a coalition or even an understanding with the SNP. One, he's effectively acknowledging defeat in Scotland, which I mean, nobody seriously thinks Labour are going to make a massive recovery in the next 5-10 years. But obviously they can't say that. But England is watching. And if you remember the 2015 general election campaign with Ed Miliband first in Alex Salmond's pocket and then Nicola Sturgeon's pocket. And I got a personal letter from David Cameron urging me to vote Conservative to stop the SNP. I got a letter with that was what the Conservatives were standing on in England: stop the SNP. So in fairness to Keir Starmer, he just cannot, because the seats in the north of England are way more important, significant for any Labour comeback. And I don't see the Labour winning the next election. But so I totally understand why Keir Starmer has to say that. And if I was advising him, that's exactly what I would advise him to say. I just don't think he could really afford to accommodate any talk of coalitions before the election. Afterwards might be a different matter, but realistically,
afterwards, politicians are notorious for saying, "Yeah, that's what I meant before, but now that I've looked at the numbers."
Well, the easy answer to that is this is what the electorate are saying.
Exactly,
but I'm still not sure that even I expect a general election end of 2022 or spring 2023. I vote Labour in England, so I'm quite happy to vote Labour. But I just, hand in heart, find it difficult to imagine the scenario where they're going to be in a position to form a government, even with a.
So you vote Labour in England. Have you ever had the MP that you voted for in Chester?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. We have a very good Labour MP actually. He had it was a tiny majority in 2015. I think it was the smallest in England actually.
That's what I thought.
90 or something like that. We had a Conservative MP before that, and then actually in the 2017 general election, massively increased majority and then in 2019 it reduced slightly, but still about 7,000. So yeah, it's a swing seat, but it's a comfortable Labour majority at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Here's a question from David. He's asking, was liberation theology in Latin America any influence on your political development and embracing Scottish independence?
That's a really good question. So for people that maybe don't know about Latin American liberation theology, it's the main thing about liberation theology. It's kind of the education and the involvement of the poor, where people actually become conscious of their own experience and the need for change. And so it's very much a bottom-up grassroots movement that then kind of takes a powerful hold. So I know that some people do interpret kind of Scottish independence as this kind of liberation movement, or the same way as other nations got independence from Britain. I think I don't really kind of look at it that way so much, although it, sometimes I think that language is appropriate with the way Westminster controls. The Conservatives keep saying Scotland's got two governments. Well, yes, one we voted for and one we didn't. So it's, I don't actually think, well, what are we getting independence from, I guess, because, Britain, we are part of that imperial kind of project, I guess, Scotland. But, I don't even think I measure up the union in terms of this in the bad column, this in the good column, and come to, I think the union is just one of those things whose time has just come. It's probably past its sell-by date. What we're now seeing is cooperation, stronger cooperation amongst independent states. And I actually think that I'm not one of these people that wants to see a massive border at between Scotland and England. I mean, I actually think we might actually have a much better relationship between Scotland, England, probably United Ireland in time, and Wales. In the same way as the Nordic countries are Scandinavian, because I've got no problem saying in some respects I'm British, but that manifests itself in a kind of cultural Britishness when I'm abroad. I don't regard Britishness in any way as a kind of state identity. I mean, I'm Scottish first. I'm probably Glaswegian second.
Do you see it a bit like the description of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark as Scandinavian? Yeah,
and then there's even the Arctic countries have got a particular formal kind of group of which Scotland is kind of a near neighbour. So I think we could actually. So all the arguments about there's family bonds of family across the United Kingdom as an argument for the union is kind of nonsense. I mean, I think those friendships would continue and actually might even be stronger. I mean, I don't regard my aunt, who is Irish, as foreign. I don't really even think of Ireland as a kind of foreign country. And so again, the rhetoric of independence will make our neighbours foreigners. I mean, well, I think as somebody said on one of these television programs, well, what's wrong with foreigners? So for me, it's not so much this great liberation movement. It's just, this is normal. And, the union has had some good, I mean, there's a lot of bad as well, but it's just, I think it's an idea that's past its sell-by date, really. So it's not that it's terrible or anything like that.
That would chime with Stephen Cottrell's view to a degree, because he's saying, let's re-examine the English question, which is really, we have to examine what this entity is, because it's not serving a purpose that it may have served in the past, which is perfectly reasonable. Alison Clark is saying, we need Paul here in Scotland.
Well, we need to get one of the universities in Scotland to give me a job then.
Stephen Kelly is raising an interesting point. He said, look, it's been, COVID-19 has been 100 days now, and on Saturday, when can you see Nicola announcing a date for an independence? It hasn't said referendum, but I assume it means a referendum.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I can only give a personal view. I've got no insight. So, I know there's the Yes movement is kind of beset by some anxiety about an impatience, and I understand that. I think one of the things, just to go back a bit, is we probably need to kind of acknowledge what happened in 2017, where folk who were perhaps impatient for independence didn't vote SNP, and they lost 20 odd seats. And we have to really understand the importance of narrative. It was, even though had the 2017 result been the result of the 2015 election, people would have still been talking about an amazing result for the SNP. The SNP clearly won that election, but we have to think about narrative. I think, all honest, again, Westminster know that the SNP won the Scottish election convincingly. The Conservatives did slightly better than they expected, but they've still got less than half the seats of the SNP. And the SNP have got 1 seat short of a majority in a PR parliament, and with the Greens, it's absolutely comfortable. And 50% voted for independent supporting parties on, I think it was the list. It was one vote or the other. Yeah. So there's a clear mandate, and I think Westminster acknowledge that privately, if not publicly, and they're preparing for a referendum. So I'm absolutely certain there'll be a referendum within the current Scottish parliamentary term. Which I think finishes in 2026, isn't it? The fly in the ointment is the general election, because if it's going to be 2022 or 2023, that kind of gives Westminster the Westminster government a date by which they can just keep saying no. But then after that, and that gives them one more shot at an election, which again, I think will be really quite critical for the SNP, for the narrative. I suspect the wheels for a referendum will be set in motion before that, because I don't think we can wait that long. So I expect, although I have absolutely no inside knowledge, I'm not part of, I think it's wise to be patient to get this right. And I think what Nicola Sturgeon has done incredibly well is to internationalise the Scottish independence question, because I think by her presence in the international stage, and I really don't get the detractors of Nicola Sturgeon. I think she's head and shoulders the best politician in Britain, and I think the SNP have been really fortunate to have Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, and 2 incredibly talented politicians. There is support for Scottish independence internationally, which perhaps wasn't there before. So I expect, what are we just now, end of 2020? I would hope that the wheels will be set in motion in the next few months. But I think we have to acknowledge that COVID has been a trauma. And for many people, the thought of independence will be traumatic as well. And I think we have to respect that. It's a perfectly respectable position not to want independence. But for those of you who do want independence, I think we have to be patient with our fellow citizens and get COVID behind us. So perhaps it will be on the new year agenda. I know people really want to move quicker than that, but my honest belief is that we have to take people with us, and it's persuading the 10% that's kind of pragmatic. I've got actually a very good friend who I use as my kind of litmus test, and he voted SNP but no in the referendum, and he's basically saying he's not particularly necessarily sold in independence, but he doesn't think this halfway house is working. So it's either remove the Scottish Parliament or independence, and realistically for him that means that pragmatically independence is the way forward. So there'll be a lot of people who will be perfectly pragmatic about this, and these are the people we have to. So I don't know what the audience for this kind of program is. So I don't know if people are now all shouting and typing all sorts of profanities in. But that's my honest opinion is that it probably won't take place before the next general election, but will take place immediately, probably more or less immediately after it. But we have to be aware that gives Westminster one more go at getting a good result. So that's my honest opinion.
It's very divided in Scotland. I think you touched upon an important factor, which I'm not sure gets the traction that it deserves. One of the ways you keep people together in difficult times, particularly when you don't know what might the shape of things in the future, is you give them a story. You give them a story that says that this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the way we're trying to achieve it, and you say it over and over again, and you give people, and that's hugely attractive to people who are particularly because we don't have a story for the whole of the UK now. It's just gone. That's if it did exist, it's now, as you say, it's passé. It's a dead parrot. It's nails to the perch, but it's gone. And I think what needs to happen in Scotland is there needs to be a story that enables people to connect with the way forward, because it's very empowering if people feel that they're heading in a direction that sort of makes sense. There'll always be people along the way who have different views about the speed, the factors that need to be involved, but provided they're on board with the actual destination and the story, and that will include some sort of timeline, inevitably. It seems to me to be important. And also, I'd like to get your views on this, because you mentioned that the middle way for your friend and maybe others seems to have sort of disappeared, and it's either a question of the status quo or independence. When I speak to unionists now on the show, what they tell me is something quite different. They say, well, the status quo is gone. What needs to replace it is home rule. So what people should be offered is a choice between home rule and independence. And when I ask them to define home rule, we end up all over the lot. It's like, however you define it, it's not consistent.
Yeah, so just to clarify, my friend is basically saying it's either scrap the Scottish Parliament or independence, and of course
exactly.
The Parliament's not always scrapped, so it's not the status. And you're right, the status quo isn't there anymore. And I think the big difference with the next referendum is that people have now been able to imagine a yes vote, and there was that poll, although yes was, I think, 48%, when people were asked what they thought the result would be, more than a third of people who planned to vote no thought that yes would win. And I think that's actually quite significant. I know that some of the headlines said if it was held in the next 6 months, but I think that was just, I don't think that was the significant part of the question. And the more people imagine independence, and the more people imagine that yes will win, then I think actually that will have its own momentum. And I think that's going to become greater. I think it's going to be very difficult for those who campaign for a no vote this time, because they can't really use the same argument before. The status quo is gone. Brexit has changed everything. It's just as much of a risk to vote no, frankly. The question about whether home rule should be offered, I would just simply reject that. I think the question will be exactly the same, and actually I think what people on the yes side are entitled to say is, give us your best offer, and that's the result of a no vote. So, rather than some nebulous vow, you need the legislation passed what a no vote would mean, and I think that I think the vow had probably had about 3%. I don't think it swung it entirely, but I think that's I don't think home rule or as close to home rule as possible. It needs to be on the ballot paper. I think that should just be the acknowledged result of a no vote. That would be I'm not a political advisor or anything like that, and I've just got these personal views, but that's kind of the line I would be taking. But I'm pretty sure everyone is gearing up for another referendum, and I'm certain. The noise is coming from like Michael Gove and so on, and even Keir Starmer was squirming. He's advocating. Those who say there shouldn't be a referendum in the next 5 years. Well, that proposition was put to the people in the election a few months ago, and it was defeated. Yeah. That's the platform that Labour and the Conservatives stood on, and they lost. So it's fine to say my personal opinion is there shouldn't be a referendum. That's a perfectly valid opinion, but they have to acknowledge that is not the view that prevailed in the election. And governments get to put their manifestos into practice. So I think everyone kind of accepts that, and we're just doing this kind of preparatory dance, really.
One of the arguments I hear, Paul, that's advanced by unionists is, ironically, you might think, is, oh, Evans, if you thought Brexit was bad, just wait until you see what happens with Scottish independence. It'll be Brexit with knobs on. The shelves will be completely empty and will stay empty. There'll be no truckers crossing the border. Boris Johnson's already said so, etc., etc., etc. So it'll be Brexit plus, Who would vote for that?
Yeah, I think that's a highly disingenuous argument. I mean, people may believe it, but I think it's disingenuous because what Brexit was removing ourselves from a social and economic partnership. Independence is not removing us from a social and economic partnership. It's removing us from a political relationship where a government resides with power in Westminster that Scotland contributes 9% of the MPs. So in some ways, if the two parties chose, actually nothing could. It's possible that nothing could change. I think Alex Salmond's Stellanization idea was probably in the best interest of England post-independence, but that was such a problem that that's obviously not going to be on the table anymore. So it is an entirely different situation. There won't be a hard border between Scotland and England, because the problem is there's already some kind of border between Britain and Northern Ireland. So I mean, actually, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland, could be in a border-free zone. But the common travel area will continue. Scotland won't be in Schengen. I would hope that Scotland would join the EU. That does create challenges, and I think we have to be honest about that. But that's actually something for the future. I mean, people may decide. I mean, I don't think it's likely, but people may decide that it's actually better not to join the EU. But I suspect that will be a minority position, and the new currency is really important. Yeah. So I don't think I understand why people who acknowledge, or at least privately, that Brexit changes everything, want to say, yes, this is just like Brexit. Of course they want to say that, but I think that's just disguising a lack of a real argument, and I think it's going to be really quite difficult to make a positive case for the United Kingdom, because the positive case can be done with independence. The positive case is the social, the kind of economic, the bonds of friendship, all of those things which frankly don't need to be disrupted if the parties agreed to it. And that just comes down to negotiation and whatever people say beforehand. I think if and I hope when Scotland votes to become independent, I think sense will prevail between the parties. Oh yeah,
there'll be a 2 to 3 year period of establishing the norms, as it were, and all the people who said that they couldn't work together under any circumstances will spend those 2 or 3 years working closely together.
Well, it's in everyone's interests. I mean, that's
the way it tends to work out. This is going to be the worst thing under the world. Oh, hold on a second, it's not quite so bad. Now that the people have spoken, we have to accept their verdict. Well, we're sort of running out of time a little bit. This has been very interesting, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. Do you have any last but perhaps brief message for the audience?
I suppose people are entitled to their views, but what I would urge is that people maybe just bring down the rhetoric a wee bit within the Yes movement, because it is really kind of, I think, disruptive and not helpful that people are at their throats. Remember, the SNP have been elected as a government as well, and they have to deliver on those government promises, but it's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate to push that government to announce when it's right a referendum on independence, which I hope everyone will get together and vote yes. But there might be that fly in the ointment with the general election. And if that comes along, I think everybody will have to vote to make sure that the SNP have a convincing showing to lead us to that referendum and to a yes vote and to independence.
Excellent, wise words. Thank you very much. Well, our time's almost up. A big thank you to Paul. And a big thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight. And thank you for your questions. We've tried to take as many as we possibly can. I hope you've enjoyed this TNT show. As ever, we have more formidable guests lined up for future shows. This is the place for the big hitters that you've just seen tonight. And remember, Indie Live What's On Guide at www.whatsonguide.scot. You'll see all the details of the forthcoming shows, I just want to tell you about next week's show, which features special guest Dr. David Patrick, who will be joining us from South Africa next Wednesday. So do make a point of joining us then. He has some very interesting views indeed. And put it in your diary now, because you'll regret it if you miss it. Honestly, I can guarantee that. Oh yes, please, a big reminder to look out for Elliot Bulmer's Constitution column in the Sunday National at the weekend. And you'll find it in the 7 Days supplement. If you like it, tell the editor. And very importantly, please support Indie Live and Indie Live Radio. These are new voices for a new Scotland and all the news that you're not getting. And if you like the TNT show, support any Indie Live fundraisers that come along, please. Thank you again. And please join us next Wednesday. And just let me conclude by saying very briefly, it's been a great day for British democracy. The UK government, and I use the term loosely, of course, we gather has spent £163,000 on Union flags this year. How about that? There's no money for lots of other stuff, but there's lots of money for flags. Please, I'd like you to please join me in thanking tonight's producer, Paul McCartney. Thanks very much, Paul, for all your help and support. And do join us next week. And just as a final thought to all of you, please stay safe and take care. Thank you again. Good night.